It begins not with a roar, but with a whisper. At 2:17 a.m., the Persian Gulf stretched flat and obsidian beneath a moonless sky, its surface reflecting nothing but the faint scatterlight of distant tanker traffic working the Strait of Hormuz 14 nautical miles to the northeast. Inside, the E-2D Hawkeye, orbiting at 21,000 feet above the task force, the combat information officer had been staring at the same rotating radar picture for 6 unbroken hours. The display was a quiet thing tonight. A predictable constellation of tanker transponders, commercial overflights, and the radar returns of Iranian patrol craft loitering near Larak Island since late afternoon. A routine provocation, categorized and forgotten. He was on his 4th cup of cold coffee when the picture changed. At 2:19 a.m., the mission computer registered a cluster of new contacts materializing on the northeastern edge of the scope. Not the sharp, fat blip of a fast mover, not a fighter jet pulling contrails at altitude. Smaller returns. Slower. But there were a great number of them. The system tagged 13 separate contacts emerging from a corridor 20 kilometers north of Bandar Abbas, altitude approximately 800 feet, airspeed 175 knots, bearing 270. Low, slow, and moving directly toward the heart of the carrier strike group. The combat information officer did not reach for his coffee. Strike, Hawkeye. Flash traffic. 13, now 14. Bandits bearing 027, Angels .8, speed 175. Formation is non-standard. Assess as UAS swarm. Repeat, UAS swarm inbound. In the Combat Direction Center, buried behind a dozen layers of reinforced steel and smelling perpetually of overheated circuit boards and recycled air, the watch team received the transmission with the particular stillness of professionals who had trained for exactly this moment and still felt the ice-water rush of adrenaline when it arrived for real. The strike group commander had been on his feet for 11 minutes already, having been called from his rack by a junior watch officer who noticed an anomaly in the electronic order of battle. A sudden silence in the Iranian air defense radar emissions that had been painting the Gulf all evening. He had learned over 31 years in naval aviation that when the adversary's radars go quiet, it is because they have found something to do that they do not want to advertise. He had been right. General quarters. General quarters. All hands man your battle stations. This is not a drill. The announcement detonated through every passageway, berthing compartment, and engineering space aboard the carrier. Sailors were on their feet before the second sentence finished, reaching for boots and battle gear by pure muscle memory, hearts hammering before their minds had fully assembled what was happening. On the flight deck, the night crew was already running. 2 A-18E Super Hornets assigned to the Combat Air Patrol were airborne and vectoring north, but the flight lead recognized a problem immediately. His aircraft were configured for long-range intercept against manned fixed-wing threats. Against a dense, low-altitude swarm at under 200 knots near the water surface, the loadout was wrong. The intercept would require close-range heat seekers and cannon employment. In the ready room below, 4 F/A-18E pilots were suiting up with the focused efficiency of men who had rehearsed this specific sequence in their sleep. Ready in under 90 seconds. At 2:21 a.m., the first catapult fired. The acceleration is not experienced as speed. It is experienced as violence. A force sufficient to propel 80,000 pounds of aircraft and human being from a standstill to 165 knots in under 3 seconds compresses the spine, narrows the vision, and produces a sensation somewhere between being struck by a vehicle and being fired from artillery. The twin afterburners ignited and painted the dark Gulf surface in columns of white-blue exhaust fire, visible from 12 miles away. 14 seconds later, the second catapult fired. By 2:23 a.m., all 4 alert aircraft were airborne, climbing hard, pulling up the Hawkeye's tactical picture in real time. The flight lead, a combat veteran with prior theater experience in 2 separate regional conflicts, was still climbing through 8,000 feet when he saw what the Hawkeye had computed 30 seconds earlier. The swarm had divided. The primary group of 9 contacts continued on its bearing toward the carrier, while a secondary element, 5 contacts, had peeled south to approach the logistics vessel positioned 12 nautical miles astern, lower than the primary group, using the Gulf's warm surface thermal layer as a radar mask. A coordinated multi-axis approach designed to split the defensive response between 2 simultaneous threat vectors. This was not a pre-programmed GPS route to a fixed waypoint. This was an adaptive attack plan, structured by someone who had studied how the United States Navy responded to maritime threats and engineered the assault to exploit the gaps in that response. The commander's tasking was immediate. Northern CAP section covers the primary swarm, alert aircraft split between the 2 threat axes. The electronic warfare officer brought the ship's jamming suite online across 4 simultaneous frequency bands, targeting the data link architecture associated with Iranian unmanned vehicle employment across multiple prior theaters. The northern cap made infrared contact at 2:24 a.m. The flight lead rolled into a descending attack, dropping toward the radar floor where the swarm was hugging the water. The targeting pod showed the contacts as a loose constellation of heat signatures against the dark Gulf, small turbojet exhaust plumes, individually almost insignificant, tracking steadily and patiently toward the strike group. There was something specifically unsettling about their steadiness. A manned aircraft under threat jinx, maneuvers, responds to the engagement environment. These did not. They simply continued, patient, committed, indifferent to everything in their path with the total certainty of machines that have no capacity for fear and no mechanism for reconsidering. The first AIM-9X departed the rail at 2:24 a.m. and 40 seconds. The seeker head acquired the leading contact's engine exhaust in under 2 seconds, corrected trajectory, and arrived in 4. The airframe disintegrated in a flash of compressed heat that lit the water surface briefly before the Gulf darkness returned. 1 down, 13 remaining. The flight lead called his second shot 6 seconds later, then his third. His wingman was running a parallel track south of the formation with sidewinders of his own, each launch called and logged for the Hawkeye's tracking picture. The consumption of precision munitions was happening at a rate that was, in itself, a form of strategic pressure. Each sidewinder represented over $400,000 of defense expenditure being traded against an adversary airframe that had cost its operator perhaps $22,000. The ratio was a deliberate feature of the attack's design. At 2:26 a.m., the first serious complication materialized. 3 of the primary swarm contacts altered course simultaneously. A 10-degree bearing shift executed in coordinated unison. A GPS waypoint drone cannot execute a coordinated course correction based on situational awareness. This maneuver required observation, decision, and command from outside the airframes themselves. Someone was watching the Intercept develop in real time and redirecting specific contacts to exploit the gaps in the engagement geometry. Man-in-the-loop control. Active. Adaptive. Watching. Hawkeye, Panther 1. 3 northern contacts going adaptive. Assess man-in-the-loop active. Request EW concentration, azimuth 025, priority. The electronic warfare officer refocused the jamming aperture immediately, concentrating power into a narrow beam at the specified azimuth with maximum sustained output. The system began operating at levels that caused 2 of its own secondary radars to partially desensitize, the electronic equivalent of shouting so loudly that you temporarily deafen yourself. The Combat Direction Center's radar picture developed a partial gap on the northeastern bearing, a shadow in the coverage that nobody had time to address. For 11 seconds, the 3 adaptive contacts continued their new bearing. The adversary's ground control team had shifted to an alternate frequency. The electronic warfare officer initiated a frequency hop sequence, cycling the jamming energy across the full spectrum of known control link bands. Reduced effectiveness per band, but complete spectrum coverage. A calculated trade between depth and breadth made in under 3 seconds without waiting for an order. At 2:27 a.m. and 22 seconds, all 3 adaptive contacts reverted to their original bearing. The man-in-the-loop link had been severed, but the frequency hop produced a thermal management fault in the jamming system's primary amplifier chain. An automatic protection circuit throttled output by 31%. The electronic warfare officer saw the amber fault indicator illuminate and felt, in that moment, the specific cold clarity that arrives when a professional recognizes that the tool they are relying on most heavily is no longer performing at its rated capability. He reported the fault without editorializing. The commander directed the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer 2 miles off the port beam to augment the jamming posture with its own electronic warfare suite. The coverage gap on the northeastern bearing remained. Meanwhile, the southern intercept had reached its own crisis point. The alert pilot vectored against the logistics vessel threat had expended 2 sidewinders, disintegrating 2 of 5 southern contacts. A third had been caught in the blast radius of the second shot. Not a direct hit, but sufficient to damage its propulsion system. It was now flying erratically, a shallow weaving descent with unpredictable lateral movement. A functioning drone follows a known path. A damaged drone follows no predictable path at all. In some tactical dimensions, a crippled airframe approaching a surface vessel is more dangerous than a fully functional one. The erratic contact descended through 250 feet at 2:28 a.m., its small turbojet producing an irregular, stuttering note, clearly audible on the cockpit audio feed. A sidewinder engagement at this altitude against a target with this degree of movement unpredictability carried unacceptable fragmentation radius risks relative to the logistics vessel's position. The pilot selected his M61A2 rotary cannon and rolled into a steep, descending approach, managing airspeed to stay in the target's stern hemisphere while pulling sufficient lead angle for the lateral unpredictability. His radar altimeter warning activating at 500 feet. He silenced it manually and held the approach. The burst lasted approximately 2 seconds, 800 feet of slant range. The rounds destroyed the propulsion system and severed the guidance linkages. The airframe ceased flying and entered ballistic trajectory. A tumbling collection of structural components and one intact shaped charge warhead that continued forward on momentum alone, clearing the final 290 meters to the water surface in the flat arc of an object that is no longer being controlled. It impacted 41 meters off the port bow of the logistics vessel. The warhead detonated on water contact. At 41 meters, the port bridge wing was within the outer edge of the pressure hemisphere. The communication array buckled and went offline. 3 meters of hull railing bent inward at the attachment points. A porthole frame cracked at its lower weld seam. The damage control team confirmed no direct personnel injuries, but structural assessment established that the port bridge communication node was fully inoperable. 6 hours to restore from emergency spares. The strike group had taken a hit. A real one. In the Combat Direction Center, the commander received the damage report and noted it on his mental ledger without expression. A mass-produced airframe assembled from commercially available components had managed to inflict structural and equipment damage on a multi-billion-dollar logistics asset crewed by hundreds of sailors. The mathematics of asymmetric conflict, expressed not as policy debate, but as a physical fact in the port bridge wing of a United States Navy vessel at 2:29 a.m. He had 30 seconds to think about it before the next report arrived. The ammunition situation in the northern engagement was becoming a tactical factor. The flight lead had 2 sidewinders remaining. His wingman had 1. The northern cap section had shifted to cannon employment against the trailing contacts, consuming time that the surviving drones were using to close distance toward the carrier. At 2:30 a.m. and 11 seconds, a contact obscured by the radar coverage gap was reacquired by the Hawkeye, and it was inside the outer defensive perimeter, 2.8 nautical miles. Bearing 345, Altitude 200 feet. Speed 170 knots. Aimed at the carrier's bow section. The flight lead had it on data link. He was 9 nautical miles north with 2 missiles remaining and an engagement geometry problem that would take 40 to 45 seconds to solve. The contact had less than 60 seconds of flight time to the hull. The carrier's Phalanx close-in weapon system had acquired the contact at 2:30 a.m. and 12 seconds. But the system's engagement authorization parameters had been modified 14 days earlier, narrowing the autonomous engagement threshold after a commercial fishing vessel had inadvertently entered the inner defensive zone during a scheduled exercise. The modification required the contact to close inside 1.5 nautical miles before the system was authorized to commit to full autonomous engagement. The change had been reasonable in the context of a busy commercial waterway. It had not been designed for this specific moment. At 2:31 a.m. and 38 seconds, the 14th contact crossed 1.5 nautical miles. The Phalanx fired. The burst lasted 6 seconds. The tungsten penetrator rounds met the 14th contact at 1.1 nautical miles from the carrier's bow, at an altitude of 175 feet above the Gulf surface, at 2:31 a.m. and 53 seconds. The airframe came apart. The shaped charge warhead detonated in the air, 1.1 nautical miles from the nearest sailor on the flight deck. The pressure wave reached the bow section as something barely distinguishable from the ship's ambient vibration. A plane captain near the bow, waiting for the next recovery cycle, happened to be looking in the right direction. He saw a brief flash of orange-white light appear and vanish over the dark water, like a camera flash at very great distance. He stood very still for a moment. Then he went back to his work. In the Combat Direction Center, the 14th contact vanished from every display simultaneously. For a single, stretched moment, the only sound in the compartment was the ventilation system and the quiet, indifferent chirp of routine status indicators. But the night was not finished. At 2:34 a.m., the signal's intelligence feed from the destroyer posted an alert that no one in the Combat Direction Center was entirely surprised to receive. 3 Iranian fast patrol craft that had been loitering 12 nautical miles northeast since midnight had increased speed and altered course toward the strike group during the peak of the engagement window. They had closed to within 9 nautical miles before the final Phalanx engagement, exploiting the strike group's divided attention as a potential window for a close-range surface probing run. When the Combat Direction Center's attention returned to the full tactical picture, the patrol craft found themselves simultaneously illuminated by the fire control radars of 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. They held their course for 43 seconds. Every watchstander in the Combat Direction Center tracked them through those 43 seconds without speaking. Then they reversed at maximum speed toward Iranian territorial waters. 43 seconds. In isolation, that is not a meaningful duration. In a Combat Direction Center that had just expended 11 precision missiles, lost radar coverage on a critical bearing, sustained material damage to a logistics vessel, managed a jamming system fault, and watched a contact close to within 60 seconds of the hull. 43 seconds felt like a geological formation, something ancient and heavy. The commander ordered full system status at 2:38 a.m. The inventory was precise and deeply uncomfortable. 11 AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles expended. Over $4,400,000 in precision munitions consumed in 13 minutes of engagement. 1 shipboard jamming system at 31% reduced output pending thermal repair, estimated 2 hours to full restoration. 2 alert fighter aircraft temporarily mission-degraded pending post-engagement airframe stress inspections. The logistics vessel's port bridge communication node destroyed by proximity detonation, 6 hours to restore from emergency spares. 3 meters of bridge railing structurally compromised. 1 porthole frame cracked. The 4 pilots landed back aboard between 2:42 a.m. and 2:47 a.m. The flight lead taxied to his spot and shut down. His plane captain climbed up to assist. The pilot sat with his visor down for a moment, hands still resting on the controls, some part of his nervous system not yet fully processing the signal that the engagement was over. Then he raised the visor. The plane captain noticed that the gloves were darkened across the palms. The flight suit across the chest and shoulders was soaked through. The pilot looked at the deck for a moment, then at the Gulf sky. Still dark, still quiet, offering no visible evidence of anything that had occurred over its surface in the past 13 minutes. He climbed out without speaking. The numbers were stark in their geometry. 14 adversary airframes launched from dispersed mobile platforms across 3 separate sites inside Iranian territory. A launch architecture designed to prevent any single precision response from neutralizing the entire capability in advance. 14 contacts neutralized. 0 vessels lost. 0 personnel casualties from direct adversary engagement. 1 vessel sustaining structural and communications damage from a proximity detonation at 41 meters. 11 precision air-to-air missiles expended in fleet defense. 1 Phalanx close-in engagement recorded at 1.1 nautical miles from the hull. 13 minutes and 16 seconds from first radar acquisition to final engagement closure. 0 airspace yielded. 0 square meters of the protected zone conceded. But the numbers also contained a second accounting, less comfortable, strategically more consequential, and absent from any headline. The adversary had launched 14 expendable platforms at an estimated combined cost of less than $300,000 and forced the expenditure of over $4 million in precision defense munitions, temporarily degraded multiple ship combat systems, inflicted real material damage on a logistics asset, and conducted a coordinated surface probing operation that gathered its own category of operational intelligence about the task force's response protocols. Every minute of that engagement had generated data: engagement timing, radar coverage gaps, jamming frequency responses, Phalanx threshold parameters observed directly from 9 nautical miles. Every future iteration of this attack type would be informed by what the adversary had learned tonight. The patrol craft had not approached by accident. They had come to watch, to measure, to take home a better model of the system they were studying. By 5 a.m., with the first gray light of the Gulf dawn turning the water from black to the color of old pewter, the strike group returned to its standard patrol posture, outwardly unchanged, inwardly recalibrated by 13 minutes of invisible, asymmetric, and deeply expensive engagement over open water in the dark. The sky over the Persian Gulf retains nothing. It does not archive the aircraft that crossed it, the weapons that split its atmosphere, or the heat signatures of 14 disintegrated airframes scattered across its surface before dawn. But the electronic warfare officer who burned the guidance link and held the frequency hop steady through training when instinct might have released it, he carries the record. The pilot who silenced the altimeter warning and held his cannon approach in the dark, he carries it. The watchstanders who delivered decisions under time pressure that preserved the fleet through 31 minutes of general quarters, they hold the record in a way that no archival document fully captures. The vigilance was not free. $4 million spent. A bridge wing fractured. A swarm scattered across 40 miles of dark water. The line was still there in the morning. That is not coincidence. That is the accumulated, unglamorous, measured cost of the people who refuse to let it move. The watch continues. That is precisely the point.